page 68. Unfortunately, it is also the case that psychoanalysts and psychotherapists who lack understanding and who think a lot of themselves claim that thinking, in and of itself, is not of great significance in the forming of the psyche, because it has to be regarded as only a quote dwarf in the infiniteness of space. In truth, this is an irresponsible assertion which is based on a would-be knowledge of the effective facts pertaining to the psyche and the consciousness. It is certainly right that, in the overall view of psychical disturbances, so-called predisposing, triggering, and sustaining conditions for a problem appear. This susceptibility, that is to say, predisposition, thereby encompasses pre-existing characteristics which can be somatic or genetic, or are based on external material influences, circumstances, and situations, and so forth. The external influences can thereby be, for example, social disparities, unemployment, oppression, and so forth, or some sort of events, experiences, the loss of a thing or of a human being, or some other kind of factors which exert an influence on the human being. And it is exactly this influence in relation to which the human being concerned begins to mentally work and, depending on his or her understanding and will, negatively or positively forms his or her thoughts, which then exert an influence on the psyche's world of feeling with the power of their might, and correspondingly influence it. The feelings are formed correspondingly, each according to the kind of the thoughts, and the feelings then determine the state of the psyche, positive or negative. If the form of the thoughts is positive, then the same kind of feelings arise through which the psyche is formed, positive and equalized. However, if the form of the thoughts is negative, then the feelings also become negative, whereby the psyche becomes disturbed and unequalized. If this state is maintained further, then as a result of the continually negative thoughts, the feelings become correspondingly also increasingly negative and transmit themselves in this form to the psyche, which thereby becomes increasingly negative, increasingly unequalized, and finally disturbed and sick. Naturally, in this form, the thoughts and the disturbed or sick psychical state become the burden for the human being, because his or her individual life becomes disturbed in every regard. The thoughts and feelings thus form the vicious cycle which influences the psyche, because the disturbed or sick psyche in turn influences the feelings in a negative form, which in turn do the same with the thoughts. Such sustaining conditions, to which the affected human being increasingly falls prey, and from which he or she is no longer able to free himself or herself, are thus created. This then inevitably leads to further wrong reactions, which then no longer relate only to the wrong and negative thinking, rather they also extend to wrong inner and outer actions, whereby also the environment is drawn into the misery, which means that, from then on, new burdens and prevailing conditions from outside continually appear, which impair the whole life situation and the disturbed or sick state of the psyche even more. This, naturally more than ever, then prevents the abating of the psychical difficulties and the solving of the problems. The situation is even such that then the problems and the wrong negative product of the thoughts, as well as the bad negative state of the psyche, become chronic. From this complex cluster of cases, it can be recognized by any rational human being that in any case, and exclusively, wrong and negative thoughts alone, which however are based on certain preceding criteria through which the wrong negative thoughts are triggered, are responsible for psychical impairments. And these criteria, or more precisely, causes, are extremely diverse and can, as already previously explained, be of a genetic, somatic, or purely external material nature, and so forth. A physical illness can therefore be just as much the trigger as can love sickness, grief, poverty, hate, vindictiveness, jealousy, imperiousness, egoism, reactions of others, chronic clumsiness or wrong modes of conduct, burdens of a social, professional, personal, or familial kind, ongoing demands, being uneducated, inhibitions, stuttering, states of panic and inferiority complexes, and so on and so forth. And as a matter of fact, a correct and rational, positive, that is to say, neutral positive equalized, thinking is able to change and eliminate these things. Parentheses. See, quote, Die Psyche, Wassermannszeit Verlag, FIGU. That's referring to the book The Psyche. The human being is able to do this absolutely through his or her own initiative when he or she recognizes the facts at an early stage and, quote, repairs his or her thoughts in the right kind and positively uses them. This, however, is unfortunately not possible in every case, because where the psyche is already too disturbed or sick, this is not only very difficult, rather practically impossible, for which reason it is appropriate in every such case to call in a psychoanalytic and psychotherapic specialist. Unfortunately, however, such real specialists are not easy to find, because not every psychiatrist and so forth is really so well educated and schooled that he or she is actually able to master such problems. Unfortunately, it is not done with psychotropic drugs, which are often quickly and willingly prescribed, nor by the, quote, trained professional merely listening. Truthfully, useful conversations and appropriate therapies are actually also necessary, and above all, a thinking by the human being concerned which is positive and freed from the destructive, negative aspects, namely positive and equalized thoughts, are the most important factor for the normalization and equalizedness of the thoughts and feelings, and thereby also for the normalization of the psyche and its recovery. And when I talk of positive equalized thoughts in regard to the influencing of the feelings and of the psyche, then it is naturally self-evident that the positive thoughts must be directed according to the psyche's corresponding behavioral level. That means that the thoughts become occupied in neutral positive equalized form with the existing terrible thing and clear it up and neutralize it. But to this end, it is first necessary that the thoughts become calm, which mainly happens as a result of the thinking being occupied with neutral material, for example, with a wish dream or the like. At any rate, with a matter or a subject and so forth which has absolutely nothing to do with the actual problem. Thereby the thoughts become calm, which leads to the actual problem then being able to be tackled calmly and considered more easily in order to gain from it the necessary cognition, which is then processed into a neutral positive equalized thinking, with which the corresponding behavioral level is worked on and influenced. This corresponds to a self-therapy, which is extremely effective and brings success in every case if it is applied correctly. The question is only whether the self-therapy can really be comprehensively applied and leads to the success, or whether outside help in the form of a suitable specialist is required. From that which has been said above, it therefore clearly follows that psychical problems can get established on various behavioral levels. Consequently, various therapies are also required. That means that every therapy must be tuned to the particular problem if it is to bring success. However, that which must be fundamentally borne in mind is that every single problem which appears, that is to say, every behavioral level, is based on cognitive factors and deficits, because every single problem and behavioral pattern is always based on perception, recognition, and thinking. If, for example, a human being suffers from inhibitions or from a physical illness, then this is perceived and recognized, which results in the emergence of the corresponding thoughts through which the feelings are influenced, and through these in turn the psyche. Thus, all psychical problems are therefore of a purely cognitive nature, regardless of which kind they may be. However, the kind of problem, that is to say, the kind of cause from which the suffering of the psyche originates, is then decisive for the form of the positive thoughts which are to be created, and for the therapy which must be carried out. So, for example, if there are behavior-related problems as a result of which the psyche is burdened or impaired, then a behavioral therapy, that is to say, a behavioral training, is consequently necessary, as well as a positive orientation of the thoughts in this form. On the other hand, if the cause of the psychical disturbance is to be found in a severe physical reaction, then preference must be given to a therapy with which these processes are changed, as for example, a biofeedback, a relaxation training, or a stimulus satisfaction, and so forth. The term, quote, cognition is a collective term for all processes, manifestations, and structures which are associated with the conscious or unconscious perception of anything. Cognition is therefore the awareness or recognition of arising factors which are then put into thoughts by the consciousness, which also directs them in specific forms, as a result of which corresponding feelings then emerge in the psyche, from which the psychical state then forms. That process is this. The psyche takes up the information, that is to say, the kind of the feelings, which in turn are formed by the kind of the thought patterns. Seen in this sense of the facts, positive forms of thoughts positively influence the psyche, or, in the negative case, negatively, via the feelings, which are aligned in the same form. In this form, preconscious processes therefore play a very important role. That means that certain conscious facts about anything are consciously, negatively or positively, worked on with the thoughts and create corresponding feelings through which the psyche is then influenced and formed. In the same form, unconscious processes of perception run their course, through which the psyche is likewise influenced and directed. In such a case, for example, a genetic, physical, or consciousness-based factor can be present, which is not consciously perceived, rather only unconsciously, and consequently also unconsciously leads, in the consciousness, to reactions of unconscious thought processes which, in turn, unconsciously create unconscious feelings which influence the psyche in the same wise, and indeed in both positive as well as negative form. Therefore, from the above it clearly follows that there is only one form in which the psyche is influenced, and indeed in the form of cognition, in the form of the perception or the recognition of practical experiences, burdens, and occurrences in the individual life of the human being. It is thereby not of significance whether the cognitive process occurs consciously or unconsciously, because in any case, conscious or unconscious thoughts and feelings are created from it, each in positive or negative form, which ultimately influence the psyche and determine whether it becomes positive or negative, that is to say, healthy or sick. Therefore, it is the case that certainly two different forms of influencing and forming of the psyche become evident, conscious or unconscious. Indeed, the opinion of psychiatry and all fields related to it, that not all psychical manifestations of a negative or positive form exclusively and solely have their origin in thoughts, is wrong. Predispositions, such as chronically clumsy behavior, the reactions of friends, acquaintances, or outsiders, as well as demands and burdens in the social or professional sphere, and experiences and events, and so forth, are therefore based just as much on perceptions or cognitions, and so forth, as are problems pertaining to personal character, genetic problems, somatic and moral problems, and so forth. And in any case, conscious or unconscious, thought processes and impulsations of the feelings are connected with it and exert a formative influence on the psyche. Consequently, in any case, the might of the thoughts alone is responsible for the state of the psyche. Positive or neutral positive equalized thinking is therefore doubtlessly necessary with every psychically disturbed human being, regardless of which cause or form called forth or calls forth the disturbance, and regardless of whether a psychoanalysis or psychotherapy or even psychotropic drugs are necessary. Thus, the assertion of psychiatry is wrong and irrational when it says that positive thinking has a counterproductive effect, whereby a psychotherapeutic treatment will first be necessary because, allegedly, positive thinking is based on a very limited cognitive concept which only relates to thinking and to language. In contrast to this stupid assertion, the truth is, namely, that a really correctly formed, properly composed positive thinking is also bound with the forming and the expression of the same kind of feelings whereby the psyche is effectively and lastingly influenced and is correspondingly changed and led to recovery. With everything, naturally the degree of psychical disturbance must be taken into consideration and recognized, because this is necessary in order to be able to decide whether a positive world of thoughts alone can lead to the recovery of a psyche which has become ill or is simply disturbed, or whether a psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, or even psychotropic drugs, are necessary in order to again achieve a normalization of the psychical state, that is to say, its healing. Anxieties, depressions, compulsions, eating disorders, inhibitions, addictions, vices, and bad psyche-burdening habits, and so forth, are thereby naturally completely different symptoms of disturbance and illness, which must accordingly also be tackled differently. Also, in regard to positive thinking. Truthfully, positive thinking, that is to say, neutral positive equalized thinking, must be directed according to the psychical disturbance, so that it can produce the required effect. Therefore, the positive thinking, that is to say, neutral positive equalized thinking, must be specifically adjusted to the symptoms of the psyche's disturbance and illness, as is also the case with a corresponding psychotherapy. But what actually is positive thinking, that is to say, neutral positive equalized thinking, in this relationship, if not actually also a form of psychotherapy? Only that the human being can do it himself or herself, or can apply it himself or herself with external advisory help. Since the human being is a basin of rationality, with his or her own conscious thinking capacity, the field of his or her perception capability is also very broadly set, and indeed in both conscious as well as in unconscious form. And especially with many psychical disorders, the phenomenon of selective perception and selective attentiveness plays a quite especially important role, whereby this perception and attentiveness cannot be equated with purely conscious thinking, because everything happens unconsciously or in exaggerated, highly conscious form, which expresses itself like a sharp clarity in the thoughts, which can degenerate to the point where it is unbearable. In this form, everything is exaggerated and overrated. Consequently, for example, with a human being who suffers from some sort of anxiety, an ambiguity of a situation or stimuli can become evident, because the sharp clarity of the brain and the thoughts sees many possibilities. And since this human being suffers from anxiety, a situation or a stimulus quickly becomes the pronounced anxiety, and indeed simply because there is an expectation of anxiety and a readiness to be anxious. In this form, for the human being who is captured by anxiety, completely neutral events, situations, occurrences, sounds, or human or animal behavior, as well as physical reactions, or weather factors and expressions of opinion, and so on and so forth, can quickly become a factor which he or she interprets as danger, although all the related fears and thoughts, as well as the resulting feelings, are absolutely unjustified and are only created by the wrong, negative thinking and the thinking pertaining to an expectation of anxiety. If a human being is depressive, then the characteristic phenomenon of a negative world view manifests. Consequently, those whose psyches are out of sorts in this way see and assess everything as negative much more often than others who display no psychical disorders. Thus, depressive human beings also report extraordinarily more often on negative, evil, wrong, or bad things than do psychically healthy human beings, whereby, however, one must consider that everything negative, evil, wrong, and bad, and so forth, always only arises from the view of the depression, and so forth, because as a result of the psychical disorder, that which is positive, right, and good is no longer recognized. From that, it can be recognized that, as a rule, depressive human beings, seen objectively, do not experience negative, evil, wrong, and bad things, nor do they have occurrences, events, and experiences, as well as practical experiences and situations of that kind to show, any more often than do psychically equalized, healthy human beings. But the reason that psychically disturbed human beings of all kinds only see black in black, and therefore negatively, is that their perceptional ability is very limited, whereby the world of thoughts also inevitably falls prey to a limitation and is only able to move in a narrow framework, and indeed in a framework which only allows the limited and negative perceptions. The thoughts are thereby forced into a cycle in which the same thoughts and themes of the thoughts appear again and again, whereby a rotation of the thoughts is practically called forth. And once such a rotation has begun to operate, then the human being who is controlled by it is barely able to free himself or herself from it anymore if he or she does not organize his or her world of thoughts in a positive wise again, and does not also broaden his or her field of perception again. In and of itself, the human being's perception is very flexible, but it quickly becomes unrealistic and limited if the flexibility is not consciously maintained through a healthy, positive might of the thoughts. Only too quickly it can happen that the capacity for perception is impaired through negative and wrong thoughts, and in certain respects, a delusional state is called forth. As a matter of fact, the border between normality and being delusional is blurred. Consequently, genius and madness can merge unnoticeably. Thus, it is not for no reason that it is said that genius and madness lie very close together. From that it follows that every human being, regardless of his or her profession and standing in society or which evolutionary level he or she exhibits, can fall prey at any time to insanity, to delusion, or simply to a psychical disorder or psychical illness. Therefore, a human being is able to still be physically and psychically healthy and equalized today, but as early as tomorrow, or in a few minutes or hours, he or she can be struck by a disorder or illness which ails him or her. Thus, the human being may believe that he or she is so psychically and physically stable that nothing would be able to knock him or her down. Consequently, he or she also believes that occupying himself or herself with the health of his or her psyche and physical body would be unnecessary, because this is complete nonsense and nothing but an undignified softness. But exactly such a kind of thinking is thoroughly wrong and already negative, because a psychical or physical disorder or illness can effectively appear at any time. If a psychical disorder or illness then actually specifically appears, then under certain circumstances, the one who is stricken by it already perceives very early on evil, wrong, and negative things which other healthy human beings do not experience, because these perceptions are simply based on things which are unreal and which are wrongly and negatively interpreted by the psychically impaired human being. If everything then takes on an extreme form, especially with ill human beings with a psychotic nature, then so-called faulty perceptions emerge, thus hallucinations. That means that they see things before them and have experiences or hear voices and sounds and so forth which do not exist in reality and consequently are also not perceptible for other human beings. The flexibility of human perception by means of the consciousness is enormously impressive, because not only visual factors are recorded, rather also physical factors and those pertaining to emotions, feelings, to Empfindungen, and to palpability. Therefore, in all these forms, perceptual distortions can also emerge, which call forth certain symptoms of disturbance and illness, which must specifically be countered with a certain therapy, that is to say, a certain method of treatment. If, then, in one case the learning and application of positive thinking, that is to say, neutral, positive, equalized thinking, may alone suffice in the resolution of a psychical disorder or illness, then in another case it may be necessary, along with the positive thinking, to carry out a suitable psychotherapy or even to take psychotropic drugs. Nevertheless, however, positive thinking is, in any case, and indeed without exception, always of the greatest importance, because without this, no healing occurs in regard to a psychical disorder or illness, and indeed, irrespective of which kind of psychical suffering it is.